Good afternoon, everybody who is sitting in the queue waiting for this thing to start. We're excited you're here. We'll start right at the top of the hour. This is about 2 minutes from now. Stay with us. One minute till we start. Stick with us. We're excited you're here. May 2018 webinar. Disclaimers: we are not attorneys. We are not offering legal advice. When you have legal questions, hire an attorney. I'm Hal Humphreys, your host. Today, background investigations, experience required, and trolls. PI Education offers these monthly webinars every month on the fourth Thursday of the month. They're free, they're informative, they're a way for you to get to know us and us to get to know you. We're glad you're here. A little bit about the structure of this webinar. We'll take a break at about the halfway point to shamelessly plug some of our educational offerings. There's a promo code in it for you, so stay with us through the entire webinar. If you need to leave to take a call or for any other reason, don't worry about missing anything. We keep the recorded webinar up here on our YouTube channel for you to come back to again and again. Oh yeah, take a minute, click on the subscribe button for our YouTube channel right now. It doesn't cost you anything, and it helps us out a great deal to have more subscribers. I'm joined today by Brian Willingham of Diligentia Group. Brian's been an investigator since 2001. He founded Diligentia Group in 2009 after nearly 9 years working with a New York investigative firm. Like most of us, Brian was fascinated as a kid by Sherlock Holmes, Hardy Boys, Nancy Drew Mysteries, and Magnum PI. Sidebar: Magnum, by the way, is about to experience a reboot on CBS. The jury is still out on this, but you can rest assured that I'll be tuning in for at least the first new show. Brian took a career aptitude test in the 9th grade, and it told him that the career that fit him best was private investigator. But of course, he wanted to go into sports. He spent a little time dabbling around in the sports world. He wanted to be the general manager of the New York Giants or Mets. Sorry about that. In 2001, fate finally brought Brian back to the world of private investigations. You can tell he loves this work and he cares about the industry. He writes about the business regularly. Check out his personal blog at diligentiagroup.com. Brian also contributes to a number of industry magazines and publications like Pursuit Magazine, PI Now, ACFE Insights for the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners. I'm pretty certain that he likes Pursuit Magazine the best. When he's not writing, investigating, or playing with one of his many tech gadgets, you can usually find him hanging with his wife and kids. If you want to learn a little bit more about Brian, check out his website, diligentiagroup.com. Be sure and subscribe to his blog updates if you haven't already. It's a fantastic blog. He talks about things in an open and honest manner. I really enjoy the blog and the posts he puts up there. I'm thrilled to introduce you to our guest for the May PI Education webinar, Mr. Brian Willingham. Brian, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, Hal, I don't think I could have written an opening a little any better than that. But
I think you did write it.
So, I mean, Hal has kind of given a little bit of a rundown of my career. My passion in my whole life was sports. I love sports. I wanted to do everything about sports, and I finally figured out that I wasn't going to be good enough to be a Major League Baseball player. So I decided that I realized that there was this whole business of sports, and I wanted to get into that. I went to college I got a sports management degree from the University of Massachusetts, one of the best programs in the country. I graduated magna cum laude, and so I got into that world. I worked for the New York Giants. I worked for Major League Baseball. I was in the blimp for the World Series of the 2000 Subway Series, working for Major League Baseball photography. And it was just a fascinating world, and I really, truly enjoyed it. But there was something missing in that business, much more than any business that I've ever been a part of. It was very much about you had to be so passionate about what you do. There was 50 people behind me that would have literally slit my throat for my job. And it was hard for me to really understand that. And they paid you like dirt. And so it was a real challenge for me. And for example, the New York Giants, who I have the absolute most respect, it's one of the best organizations in all of sports from so many different levels. And I had a great boss there, Pat Hamlin. Shout out to Pat, who's certainly not listening to this, but he was an incredible boss. But every person, I was an intern there, every person above me had been there for 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And that was 18, 19 years ago. Pat Hamlin is still there as the head of communications. So for me, who was somebody who was very rah-rah, I wanted to bust my ass to get to the next level. And I realized that I would probably have to move to a different state, country, and another state or city to do that. And I was very tied to my roots here. Anyway, long story short, I started working for my father's investigation company here in New York. And it was meant to be like a temporary thing. I wasn't going to be doing this for a long time. And 17 years later, I'm still doing it. And, it wasn't like a love at first sight thing. There was clearly a history there of, I wanted to be in this business from when I was a kid, Hal mentioned the story. But I just absolutely, day by day, year by year, I've just grown to love what I do. And I've even loved it even more since I've been out on my own. I've had this just incredible experiences working with a bunch of different firms, doing some really, really interesting work, which we'll get into in a little bit. So that's a little bit about me.
Okay, that's good to know. And just full disclosure, Brian and I we've known each other for several years. I consider him a friend. He's worked with us at PI Education. We have one of his courses up as a masterclass. It is a pretty in-depth course on open source intelligence. We also have a 6-hour continuing education version of the course at PI Education. And at the halfway mark today, we're going to offer a 10% discount code on that, but stick with us and we'll give you that. Really quickly, it seems like we've got kind of the private investigator group of the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners all meeting here today. I know Eli Rosenblatt is in the crowd and Kelly Paxton as well. So we're tickled that you guys are here with us. And we're talking today about background investigations primarily. And the reason we decided to do the webinar on background investigations today, Brian had a blog post couple of weeks ago that dropped that got some pretty interesting feedback. Do you mind, Brian, to kind of tell me about that blog post and what prompted it? What's it about? Kind of give me the Cliff's Note version of that blog post.
So the Cliff Note version is there's a new coach of the Detroit Lions who was just hired a couple weeks ago, a guy named by the name of Matt Patricia. He's been a part of the New England Patriots coaching staff for a number of years. He was hired a couple of weeks ago, and the Detroit News came out with this story that Matt Patricia back in 1996 had been charged with sexually assaulting a woman while he was vacationing in Texas. I think he was a grad student. And this kind of thing was fascinating to me on a whole bunch of levels. And I'm sure we're going to get into that. But the general gist is the Detroit Lions never knew about this. The newspaper called them for a comment. They said they had never been aware of it. And they had this kind of shitstorm, for lack of a better term, of bad publicity. How did they not know about it? And in this movement of, the Me Too movement and all this stuff, it's obviously become more at the forefront. And the big question from an investigator's mind, there's all kinds of other topics of, should they hire somebody in this day and age that has that kind of thing, which is not my business to even broach. But from an investigative perspective, how in the world could they miss this? And I sat down, the article came out, and I remember this vividly because the article came out. I usually scan the headlines every morning. When I blog, I used to blog once a week, and I used to have so much more inspiration and time to do this stuff. But lately, work just kind of overtakes everything, and I haven't done it as much, even though it's kind of been my New Year's resolution to do that. So I usually get inspired by something, and this really inspired me to write something because it's such an important topic. There's so many misconceptions about background investigations and what can you find and how to find it. There was an article the other day in the USA Today about how to do a free background check, which is basically go to Google and type in a couple of names. So there's just so many misconceptions about it, from doing a Google check to doing vetting somebody that's going to be a potential vice presidential candidate. So that's kind of what sparked this whole thing.
So let's kind of break it down from the very beginning. When someone says, I want to hire you to do a background investigation, what does that mean to you?
I think the biggest thing is finding some context. So there's everything from, and all these terms kind of get thrown up in one big package: a background check and a pre-employment screening, all the way to vetting for a vice presidential candidate. And to give a little bit of my history, because I think it's important for this discussion, for the last 17, 18 years, I've been a private investigator. I've done a lot of different kinds of worked on litigation matters, white collar support, due diligence investigations. But one of the areas I've supremely focused on is open source and public records, digging deep into a person's background. And this started early in my career when we were doing hedge funds, were becoming much more popular back in the day. And obviously they're very popular now, but banks and people who are investing with them, there was a number of hedge fund frauds, and people realized, like, hey, we should probably be checking out these people that we're handing millions of dollars to. So I was in that business, and we were doing really deep dives on these guys, checking everything in the public record and open source to identify any issues. And that issue could be whether they were an axe murderer, do they have a history of criminal activity, do they have bankruptcy records, is there, did they leave every one of their jobs like after a couple months, which would suggest something. Between real serious stuff and sort of reading between the lines. And over the years, that work has kind of gone by the wayside. But I do a lot of work for hedge funds. I've worked for one of the political parties, vetting some vice presidential candidates. And I was literally on a team of 30 to 40 lawyers and investigators who were literally looking at every piece of material that this person has ever published, written about, reviewing property records of their families and loved ones, and criminal records of their families and loved ones. So, what I'm trying to show is that there's a vast array and a vast difference between doing a pre-employment screening and doing something like vetting the next vice president. And there's everything in between, and context really, really matters. So if somebody asks me, I want to do a background check on my nanny, that means something very different than I'm going to be handing this guy $10 million and I need to know what his deal is. Or I'm about to go to jail. This is the key witness in the case, and we need to make sure that we know every single thing about him because he's lying or whatever the case may be, to destroy his credibility, or not destroy his credibility, but try to help with the jury. And there's everything in between. So what a background investigation, to me, it really depends on context. And one of the things that we're going to be talking about here, and one of the troll part that Hal was talking about, was some of the comments on the blog where that this was a pre-employment screening, and we're not allowed to look at these certain types of criminal records and those kind of things. And to me, the context was lost there. You're talking about an organization who has hundreds of millions of dollars, who has a lot on the line, is a very public organization, and there's a public face of a person. And what the argument is that we're not supposed to be looking beyond sort of 7 years of criminal history and those kind of things. And my argument is that just, you lost the context. This is something that is extremely important, and the Detroit Lions not even knowing about this, to me, was just an absolute travesty.
Yeah, and I think for something like that, they, maybe they don't make a hiring decision based on this ancient information that was, realistically, it was a charge that was brought. I don't think he was ever indicted. I don't think he was ever tried. So it was just a charge made against the guy. So maybe they don't use it as a hiring decision, but it's probably good information for them to know, because, as happened, the Detroit Free Press comes out with an article saying, hey, what about this? And they didn't even know about it. It's good to know about these things, I think, especially in a high profile case like this. You mentioned a couple things as you were talking about that, and I think most of the folks in the webinar today know that the bulk of my work is criminal defense work. I work for attorneys who defend people, citizens accused of bad crimes. And when we have a key witness for the prosecution, or even for the defense, is going to be getting on the stand and talking, I want to know as much as I can about that person. I want to know, what they've said to the news media. I want to know what they've said to their friends. I will interview as many people as possible to find out how credible they may or may not be. If you've got an expert witness who is testifying for the other side, it's very useful to go through and investigate that person and find out if they are who they say they are. I know we've talked about this a couple of times, Brian, but you remember the Netflix documentary,
No.
Making a Murderer. There was a private investigator in that show who basically got Brandon Dassey to sign a document saying whether he was sorry for what he did or not sorry for what he did. There wasn't an option of, I didn't do this. And that private investigator works sometimes as an expert witness for prosecutors and defense teams, and had someone dug into his background a little bit more, they could have found out that he might have been a little bit of a charlatan, and it wouldn't have taken that much time to figure that out. So again, context is key. What field are we playing on? Are we, at the minor league level and it doesn't really matter, or with the major league level and everybody's going to see it? Those are things you've got to think about. I will say this, and I want to get your take on this, Brian. I hear a lot of investigators that do a lot of family-related work, surveillance for divorce cases and stuff like that. And that work is good work. It is solid work, and I have done it. I will probably do it again at some point, just because it's good work, and I'm not offended by it. But I've heard a lot of those folks that do that and nothing else, when they talk about a background investigation, they'll log into a database that all of us investigators have access to, and they'll print out the thing. They may or may not change out the headers with their company logo, but they present that information as their background investigation. Tell me about what you think about that. What is that? What is that?
Horseshit. Listen, this, and I've written about this too before, and I wrote about this a couple weeks ago. And it was I wrote a tongue-in-cheek article about the shitty background investigation, and it's exactly that. It's a investigator handing a client some 50 to 100-page report that is a TLO or an Accurant or a LexisNexis or an IDI or a Delcoin or whatever database that these investigators use, and it just hands them this piece of raw data that includes hundreds of pieces of information that hasn't been vetted, verified, analyzed, nothing. And it means something to us. It's a starting point as an investigation, but in no stretch of the imagination is that a background investigation. It's just not. And the particular case that I kind of talked about in my blog post a couple of weeks ago, it was a big business who wanted some information on some people, and some other investigative firm handed them like a TLO report and maybe did a couple of court searches. It looks like they did a couple of court searches, but they didn't pull any documents. They didn't do any type of analysis. It was just hundreds of pages of horseshit is effectively what it was. And it's unfair to a client. It's unfair to our industry to hand that off as a background investigation. Listen, that's my 2 cents. That's not certainly, maybe everybody doesn't have that opinion. And I understand that there are clients that are just unwilling to pay for a real background investigation, whatever the case may be.
Right.
And I think there's always cases. I mean, every investigator has this issue, and the issue is, what is a client willing to pay for? And if somebody's going to be going in for murder and going to be sitting in jail for a long time, it's obviously worth a lot to them. But whether or not they can afford it, that's a whole different ballgame. So listen, I think there's a big problem in our industry when you start handing that stuff out, because for one, it's not complete. Sometimes it's not accurate, and handing somebody something that has zero analysis whatsoever, I don't think it does anybody any favors. In this particular report, it was interesting. They had identified a bunch of social media, and they said, oh yeah, they have a bunch of pictures on there, whatever, put a link to it or something. There's no analysis. Like, did this woman, was she smoking joints on there, or was she talking about her wife and kid, talking about her kids and her family? You have to provide some context. I mean, context is absolutely critical. And in that particular scenario, but just to clarify, I think the client, I don't know, the client ultimately went to another investigative firm and did a more in-depth investigation, because they realized what they got was kind of half-assed. They wanted more.
They wanted an investigation done.
They wanted an investigation done. So the context is absolutely critical.
So we've talked about this on a number of occasions. When I start an investigation, one of the first places I go is TLO, TLO XP. It's a fantastic tool in our PI toolbox. There are other databases that are as good in different ways. Delve Point is another one, Accurant, LexisNexis. Those are the kind of standard databases where private investigators start. I look at TLO as a starting place. I get the information on the person. I run a TLO report. A lot of times with 5 or 6 minutes looking through the criminal charges on a TLO report, you can tell, oh, that's somebody that shares the same name, but it's obviously not our guy. The date of birth is different. Our guy never once lived in, Pocatello, Idaho. And there's a criminal charge in Pocatello, Idaho for him. You can suss that stuff out. That's just a little bit of analysis, just looking at the TLO report. That's more useful than just handing over the report. Furthermore, you don't want someone to see a thing and think really badly of someone just because they share a name with someone else. So I look at TLO as a starting place. It's a place to kind of gather information on where the person has lived in the past, where they haven't lived, where you might want to go dig deeper for more information. You've got the counties lived in list on TLO and other databases. It's a great place to kind of point you in the direction to then start doing the investigation.
Yeah, listen, you're absolutely 100% right. It's one that I will always start there in almost every single case. Even if I get a case on somebody, if I'm interviewing a witness, I just want to get a sense of who they are. And it's like with anything else, like you can go on somebody's Facebook profile and get a general sense of what they're about by just kind of scrolling through things. But it's not until you get into the weeds, I mean, and you find that little nugget of information. People have been like, fired over jobs from tweets that they sent 5 years ago. And there's not always cases where you need to go that deep, but those are the kinds of things that you need to do. It gives you an overview. It's like scrolling through somebody's Facebook profile. It'll tell you that they lived in a bunch of places and this and that and the other. But for example, criminal records, and I know people have used TLO as like their source of criminal records. I don't have a number of how many criminal records they have compared to what's in the United States, but I guess that it's less than 5%. And I think there's this theory that they're all in there, and they're just not.
I can say for sure that they're not. I had a witness in a case in Texas that I was working on. It was a murder case. We had a witness that was for the prosecution, said some pretty bad things about our guy. I got the name right before the trial, ran a quick TLO, did not think Texas, a lot of the counties don't report to the state on minor offenses, and some of them don't report to the state on felony offenses. So there are a lot of points of data that are in Texas that never make it to the state, much less to TLO. So when our guy got on the stand, it hit me. I was like, oh, shoot, I didn't get a state level background information about his criminal history, and I didn't go to the counties. And I started doing that, and we found some stuff while he was on the stand being questioned. It was because I didn't do my job thoroughly on the front end. So, you don't always have to dig 6 ways to Tuesday. I mean, Brian, you and I both have this bad thing, and I think a lot of really good investigators have this thing where we will go down rabbit hole after rabbit hole after rabbit hole, given the time and resources. It's just what we do. But sometimes that's not what's needed. But I guarantee you need something more than just a TLO report or an accurate report or something like that. That information needs to be verified.
Absolutely. And I think one of the big things, and I'm going to bring this back to Matt Patricia, but part of the thing about being in a background investigation, we all love those rabbit holes. That's what kind of keeps us going. I spent a couple hours in a rabbit hole last night, and I got out and I was like, holy shit, what just happened? I was trying to find these connections between all these parties, and it just I was in the deepest, darkest parts of the web. I don't even know where I was. So the rabbit hole, TLO, I lost my train of thought. Context, Matt Patricia.
It happens. I'm going to ask you, we've got a question from the crowd. Dave Hahn asks us, he brings up an interesting point. He said, this is why we need standards for background checks. Too much confusion with the general public. How do you feel about having a standard for background checks?
I think it's a really interesting concept. But I think, part of the thing I was going to talk about is education. You need to educate clients. That's what we do. And part of doing a background investigation is having a method. Like, for example, one of the things that is absolutely critical with background investigations are a couple of things. One is social media, reviewing social media, making sure they're not saying shit or doing shit that they're not supposed to be. 2 is criminal records. You want to be as absolutely thorough as possible. And being as thorough as possible means doing on-site court checks when you need to, using various sources, going down, searching county court websites and all the places that they lived over some period of time, whether that's a pre-employment and you're searching back 7 years, or in Matt Patricia's case, which it was 22 years ago. bringing this a little bit back to the Matt Patricia, hopefully that answers your question, David. But I think absolutely there needs to be some sort of, methods to this, searching civil records, searching bankruptcy records, and some of the sex offender records, and some of the sort of big red flag issues. There's always things you can do way beyond that, doing a complete social media analysis, reviewing news media, verifying their employment, their degree, looking at UCC filings, judgments, gathering all this information, providing a report. So there does, I think, from an education, you need to educate your clients and making sure that they understand what you need to do. Getting back to, I realized what I was going to talk about before, getting back to the Matt Patricia thing, one of the things when I first read the story was, because there are things in a background investigation that you just might not find. This whole Me Too movement is kind of shown that, in the sense that, nobody knew that Matt Lauer or whoever else had all these issues because one or a couple people had kept them secrets for a long time. So the things that we are researching are sort of public records and open source. So when I first saw the story, I'm like, holy Moses, did somebody come forward after 22 years and tell the Lions, the guy finally got a head coaching job, and tell them that? But the case is that this was in a Lexis. I did a 3-second search on LexisNexis, and it was there, which LexisNexis has a bunch of nationwide records that they all put together. I didn't even run on TLO, but they might be on TLO as well. And it happened to be in a county. Matt Patricia was going to school in upstate New York, Rochester, I believe. This happened in South Padre Island in Texas. He was on vacation. So as a background investigator, I wouldn't be searching there. So unless these records were digitized, were in some database somewhere that I could easily access, it would never have been found. However, it was in LexisNexis, so there really was no good sort of excuse. So, one of the things that I always talk with my employees about, as well as in this training course, is that you need to combine sort of the criminal checks in their states that they lived in, counties they lived in, along with some sort of nationwide database. And I realize that's sort of a misnomer because there's not really a good nationwide database. But this is a perfect example. This is an example of, there's a bunch of criminal records in databases. They may have traveled 4 counties over and got arrested, or were in Miami Beach or in Vegas or wherever. And that's the only way you're really going to find the record. When I was used to do this sort of hedge fund stuff a lot more often, there were sort of a lot of bad boys in the hedge fund industry at that point. And we used to have this thing called like a hotspot search, where we would search, 10 jurisdictions in the United States where we felt that these guys might be going to party and might have been arrested for drugs, soliciting a prostitute or whatever. Vegas, Los Angeles, Miami Beach, Texas, New York, various cities around the country, including some of the ski areas in Colorado. And we came up with a couple of hits, nothing earth-shattering that would have changed the world. But, those are things that would be very, very difficult to find unless you knew where to look.
Right. So it's right at the halfway point. I want to read a couple things that made me smile. We've got PI Becky who says, you need to always run backgrounds several different ways, not just one data search alone. PIs are getting lazy by using only one database. You need to physically search court documents in person, stuff like that. I love hearing investigators say that and recognize that this is work. It's not just a keystroke and you charge someone $150. It's work. It takes time. It takes effort. Bill Mitchell, who is a PI education adjunct instructor, says, clients' needs are never the same. Budgets are always relative to the scope of any background. So is the purpose. And I think that's one of the things you were just talking about, Brian. It's the scope of work that you develop with your client. I had a criminal case that I was working on in Fort Worth several months ago, and we developed a list of counties where the subject of the investigation had lived. We kind of knew when he had lived in each one of those counties. And I sat with the attorney and their client, and we discussed how far back do we need to go? What what kind of things do we need to look for? And we developed a scope of work that fit within their budget and answers the questions they wanted answered. I'm going to take a second here and take a break and shamelessly plug some of the PI Education products. PIeducation.com. Visit our website, check out our courses. We have a discount code for Brian Willingham's open source intelligence course. It is approved for 6 hours of continuing education. You'll get 10% off, and the discount code is Intel18, Intel 18, all lowercase, no spaces, INTEL 18. If you key that in as you're checking out, you'll get 10% off of Brian Willingham's course on open source intelligence. This is the PI education version of the course. So check that out. I think you'll get a kick out of it. There's some really good information in there. I've taken the course 3 times now, once in filming Brian doing it, once in reviewing the material, and then second, just as a learner, just so I could see how it looked. Russ Connor says you have some great points on what not to do, but training should be more focused on how to do it. You've told us what not to do. Now tell us how to do it the right way. Brian, I'm going to let you take that. Let's just walk through kind of your standard mid-level, not deep dive judge or congressional candidate that's going to be scrutinized 6 ways to Tuesday, but just like a standard one. Let's just walk through the process.
So there's a couple things that would be in my standard process, and what I would describe as sort of a red flag background investigation. And what I'm trying to identify is big red flags in somebody's career. And this I would typically do for, somebody who's being hired as a VP of a company, in a context of, that they're probably going to be okay, that they're not the proverbial axe murderer, but you just want to make sure. The client wants to sort of check the box and make sure that there really is no significant issues.
And these fall under the realm of what would be called due diligence investigations.
Sure.
And what does due diligence mean?
Doing your homework. I mean, that's in the short term, that's what it means to me. In my world, I work for a lot of private equity firms, and they describe it as a due diligence investigation. And they are doing their homework to make sure that what they're investing in is legitimate, and the people are legitimate, and the business is legitimate. They do a whole bunch of due diligence, like financial due diligence and legal due diligence, to determine if there's any, legal issue. If they buy this company, are they going to be assaulted with a bunch of lawsuits for whatever, environmental issues or whatever things may be relevant to that business.
Right. So just to interrupt really quickly, and I apologize. When it comes down to it, and I've worked on some of those due diligence cases as well, when it comes down to it, the investigator who's hired on the ground to look into C-suite executive number 1 or number 2 or number 3, we are just one small part of a larger due diligence package. And the clients usually have an idea of what they have budgeted for that and what they expect from the investigator on that. So go back to telling us what that looks like.
Yeah. So here would be, I'm going to go through my steps, and a lot of this stuff we go through in the course, and we're not going to get into too much detail here, but I'll try to give you a little bit of a sense of what I do. I'm always running multiple comprehensive reports on somebody. I am running at least a TLO, an IRB, and an IDI. I want all 3 data sources to determine. There's a couple things I'm very interested in. One is what jurisdictions that they've lived in. All of them tend to have a little bit of a different address history. So I'm very interested to see where their address history overlaps. I'm making sure in my review of their social media and whatever else I'm kind of Googling sort of in the initial stage of my investigation, I'm making sure that address history matches up to what I'm seeing. If they have a LinkedIn profile, does it show that they've lived in these various states? Does it show that they've been out of the country? And is it matching up with that address history? That address history is absolutely an essential part of doing an investigation, because I need to make sure that I'm covering those jurisdictions, both civilly, criminally, and whatever else locally that I need to obtain. The civil and criminal records are, to me, are sort of the bread and butter of what you're really looking for. You want to make sure that that person is not a convicted criminal or has some serious allegations in litigation. So that's sort of my initial step. From there, I'm sort of figuring out, depending on if I have the budget or not. And this would go from the beginner level to the VP level. If I'm doing a vetting of a vice president of the United States of America, I am sending people out to each one of those courts and making sure that going back as far as I can, and if I need to hand search back to 1978 when they were in that county, I'm going to do that. If a client doesn't have as much budget, I'm trying to find as many online sources as I possibly can. Legitimate online sources. I'm not talking about, just running it on TLL, but many, many, many counties. Miami-Dade being one of them. It's a lot in Florida. Florida is like the mecca of public records. Most of those counties actually use the same internet system, the online searching system, as you can get online. So it doesn't make any difference for me to send somebody down to the court or to do it online. And I know that because I've contacted various of these over the country all the time. I am making sure that I can cover, the whatever superior court is and whatever lower courts might be in that county. So for civil records, there's going to be some level of higher court, which is usually a case which involves $5,000 or more, or in New York, it's $25,000 or more. And with criminal cases, it would be felonies and misdemeanors, and at the lower courts, it might be infractions and things along those lines. So I'm trying to identify which of those courts that I need to search. And I'm doing the research, and I'm also supplementing all of those searches with LexisNexis database search, which covers a lot of civil and criminal records around the country, Pacer, and whatever else. In many cases, I can even contact many counties around the country are much nicer than the ones in Los Angeles or New York, and you can actually call them on the phone, and they're absolutely the most pleasant people in the world, and they'll do the search right over the phone. So that's sort of my bread and butter. Trying to go through this a little bit quicker and just trying to think off the top of my head. Pacer searches are absolutely critical. Sex offender registries is absolutely critical. I'm also interested in historical news media. You can always find some really interesting stuff in historical news media. LexisNexis is sort of my go-to database. And some sort of social media review. That's always been, it's absolutely exploded what people use on social media. And I'm not only looking at the individual themselves and identifying Twitter, Facebook, Instagram accounts, but also looking at their friends and family and seeing what connections they have, what they've liked, what they haven't liked. Those are sort of the big sort of low-hanging fruit for me. As to, I'm verifying their identity and their date of birth, doing the civil and criminal searches in the jurisdictions that they've lived, doing social media review, bankruptcies. Obviously, if anybody has ever filed for bankruptcy, it's a red flag to me, depending on the position that they're in, but it shows us lack of, financial wherewithal, or if they filed multiple bankruptcies, obviously that's important. But on top of that, bankruptcy records give you, historical salary information, their liabilities and debts and those kind of things. And so that's kind of my general sort of go-to red flag. I want to make sure that this guy has nothing absolutely serious.
Okay, so it's basically and I like to say when I'm in a presentation setting or in a classroom setting, I like paper. I like getting paper. I like going to the courthouse and pulling paper, having documents in my hand. We can do that digitally. I think some of the searches you're talking about would qualify as kind of deep web searches. They're not readily available through Google. You may have to go through the county porthole to get to that information. But you're talking about Miami-Dade County has a really good, easily searchable database. Davidson County in Nashville, Tennessee has a really easy searchable database. They have it for criminal courts. They have it for property records. They have it for civil cases. It's easy to go in and search, and you don't actually have to physically go down to the courthouse. Now, I have found personally that if I'm working and the budget is there, going down to the courthouse and pulling a document, and sometimes looking 5 documents ahead and 5 documents behind reveals some interesting stuff that maybe you wouldn't find in a simple online search. But again, we're getting down to budget, scope of work, and what someone can pay for. I want to go back to when you and I spoke last week about doing this webinar. One of the reasons we talked about it is you had some negative comments on your blog post from folks questioning your background as an investigator. I think somebody said you were an investigator wannabe. You had absolutely zero law enforcement experience. I want to talk a little bit, and I don't want to beat a dead horse, but I do want to talk a little bit about what is it about a law enforcement background that makes one a better or not better investigator, in your opinion?
Absolutely nothing.
Okay.
I think that's the short answer. And I listen, I have utmost respect for people who've been in the law enforcement industry. This person who had commented on me, I don't have any experience in law enforcement. I'm a wannabe in background investigations. And to me, I don't understand the connection. I totally, there are absolutely cases that where an investigator who has some sort of law enforcement background is absolutely essential or is helpful in doing a particular case. And there's cases that I will absolutely not take because I don't feel like I'm a right fit, and I will be happy to tell a potential client that. But listen, I've been doing this a long time. To me, what your background doesn't make all that much difference. What matters to me is that you're a practitioner and you're an expert in what you do. And I would never, ever put that label of an expert on myself. But I'm a practitioner. I do this every single day. I've been, I mentioned before that I've done vice presidential candidates and working with a team of some of the smartest people I've ever met in the world. And I've worked with a number of the biggest investigative firms in the world. And I know that I can hold my own. So it doesn't, what my background makes absolutely no difference. I could have been a baseball player. I could have been anything I want. But after 17 years of doing this and doing it on a daily basis, I don't just talk about this. And some people just see me as a talking head and writing blogs and stuff. I do this every day. I've been here I've worked about 100 hours last week, and this is what I did. So, that's how you become really good at this stuff and know what you're doing, by being a practitioner.
Yeah. And I agree with you 100%. And the reason I brought it up is I think there are a lot of times when people think for one reason or another. I had a meeting several years ago with an attorney here in Nashville, and he said, I only work with ex-law enforcement. I'm like, that's totally fine, man. I'm not your guy then. And I get that. That's fine if that's the way that lawyer wants to work. He's a criminal defense lawyer, and there is a really strong argument that former police officers can look at police reports and look at information coming from the district attorney's office and tell things about it that I can't because I don't have that background. I don't know how the Form 422 works. You know what I'm saying? Or the Form 8695 works, or whatever the form happens to be. But what I can do as an investigator is I can dig, I can be curious, I can look for the things that matter to my client. And I think that's where the rubber meets the road. It's like, how do you approach this business? Do you just check off boxes, or do you get out there and dig and look for things? I did have an investigator one time imply that since he was former law enforcement, he had access to some databases that the rest of us didn't have. There's a case in Nashville that happened last month. I think April 27th, this guy was indicted on 57 counts of accessing the criminal justice database here in Nashville for unapproved purposes. He was researching people on whom there were no open investigations. He was just doing this research on his own. There's some reasons why he was doing it, but the bottom line is he was indicted for accessing these databases without permission. Law enforcement does have access to information that we don't have immediate access to. And there's a reason for that. That's okay. But we as private investigators don't have any special access to those things. And even if you're a former law enforcement, you probably don't have access to those things. And if you do, just know full well that those databases are audited and they're checked. And if there's not an open investigation, like happened here in Nashville, the guy was indicted on 57 counts of accessing information that he was not supposed to access. So I think at the end of the day, a background investigation from a competent professional investigator who does this on the day in and day out basis is what you're looking for. You're not looking for some kind of special access. You're not looking for some kind of superpower trick. You're looking for someone that's going to dig and do the work.
Yeah, listen, and especially in cases where you're handing something off to a client, if it's a potential legal matter, you have to be able to stand by what you got. How did you get it? And where did it come from? And I don't pretend that I have some secret access to anything. And some investigators don't like to tell that to clients. They like to put on this facade of secretness. But I think it's just silly, personally. It's about knowing where to get information and how to get information legally, legitimately, and I can stand in front of a court, in front of a judge, and put my hand up and say, "This is how I got it, and this is where it came from," and be completely honest and open about how that process happened.
And when we're dealing with civil cases and even criminal cases, if you found a piece of information that you're hoping to use in trial or in a court of law, you've got to be able to say, here's how I got it. Here's how I came about it. And you got to show your work, basically. You can't just walk in and say, I've got this piece of paper that's, damning. Now, I do know that in certain family law matters, people oftentimes don't want this thing to go to trial because it's going to make their personal business public record. So they'll use stuff that was gotten maybe not entirely appropriately in the mediation process. But at the end of the day, if you get the information in a shady fashion, it's not going to do you any good. And in fact, it may harm you.
Yeah, absolutely. And listen, I think this kind of goes without saying. We talk about open sources and public records constantly here. But there's so much beyond that too. I mean, there's you can bang on the ground and boots on the ground is the term I was looking for, and talk to people. You're going to get a whole different sense about a person from talking to people. And one of the examples I always use with that is in my area, in general, there's people that hire, nannies. And usually they're young girls who came from a foreign country who are here for some short period of time and are watching kids for a period of time. And they want to do a nanny background check. And I always find it fascinating that none of these people who are relatively wealthy or just don't want to really pay for it, but that's neither here nor there, or pay what it really costs. But the issue with that, for example, is that here's a person who's been here for a year. A background check on their criminal history or their civil history or all this stuff, their social media, is not going to find you all that much. And the reality of going back to their country of where they're from is, and doing background research there is probably going to be not all that beneficial either, because they're 19 or 20 years old and probably not going to be much available about them. And in that particular case, the most critical thing in a background investigation is not a Google search or a criminal search or anything. It's talking to people who they worked with, their friends, and calling people unsolicited, not people who have somebody's handed you 5 names. Here, go talk to these people. Those are obviously important people to talk to, and the feeling that you get from it, what is your gut feeling on this person? We don't have all the right answers, and Hal can talk about this much better. There's some statistic about whether you can tell if people lie or not. Investigators maybe can a little bit better than the average person, but it's in your gut. I'm not going to be able to tell you one way or the other. You have to have a gut feel about whoever that is. And the only way you're going to do a background investigation on that person is by talking to people.
Right. And one of the things I've done in the past, and when I'm working on a criminal case, is I will interview a number of witnesses for that case. And I always, after I'm done with the interview, I stop pretty quickly thereafter and write a list of thoughts and impressions, my thoughts and impressions about the person. How might they present as a witness? What did they have on? What did their house look like? Was it clean? Was it messy? Just was the yard well kept? Was it junky? Just little details like that, because those things go into kind of paint a picture of what a witness may look like. For background investigations, I have a friend who has been nominated for a judgeship And I know for a fact that the FBI has been going around talking to lawyers that this man has worked with. And they've talked to several lawyers in that process. That's what goes into making a thorough deep dive background investigation, is going and talking to people, getting the paper, getting the stuff. And then it comes down to the analysis part, which at the end of the day is your thoughts and impressions as an investigator. You've been doing this for 17 years. You know what you're doing. You kind of get an idea of red flags. You're not saying, hey, this guy is a fraud. You're saying, hey, this guy's got this in his background. And, in my experience, I've seen this be a red flag before. Maybe it's something to look into.
Yeah, and I think that's an excellent point. And I think, you have to be able to provide context to your client as well. Like, is this a normal behavior? Is it normal for somebody to have 6 bankruptcies? It doesn't seem normal to me. But as somebody who has done this over and over again, you can provide that context to them as well. There's everything ranging from a Google search to the most in-depth, you were talking about before, like somebody comes to you and says, I want to know everything about that person. And that's just comical to me, but it is what it is. But that can range from doing a Google search to literally spending a couple $100,000. And it's interesting. A couple of years ago, I wrote a blog about the FBI released their background check on Steve Jobs, I think it was. Anyway, they released a report, and it was fascinating because their background investigation was exactly what we're talking about here. They sent FBI agents out to every court. They interviewed people. They did all the things that we're talking about, searching through every open source and public record and talking to people and doing things relating to the companies that they used to work for. Did their companies ever have any criminal activity? Were they involved in any severe controversies? Going soup to nuts. And I estimated in my blog post that it would probably cost $150,000 for me to fly all around the country and do all this stuff. So there is just this wide gap. And when I educate clients about this stuff, and somebody says, I want to know everything about that person, I'm like, all right, I'll send you an invoice for $150,000. And when that's paid, I'll start working on it. But there's everything in between. And I just don't think, in this world of instant, people just don't understand what we do. And I'm constantly educating clients, very smart clients, about this stuff. And it's important that they understand what the whole process is.
And part of that idea of people don't understand what it is we do comes from this idea of investigators holding things really close to the vest, and I'm not going to tell you how to do this because it's top secret. I have special powers, those kind of things. That doesn't do the industry any good.
No,
they think your clients think you have a superpower, and it's going to take you 5 minutes to find a thing that it takes most of us, 3 or 4 days to find. It doesn't do the industry any good to do those things. I'm a big fan of your blog for a number of reasons, but one of the main reasons is the way you're honest about what it takes to do the work. And I think for clients, that is a huge bit of knowledge to understand. What we do as private investigators on a daily basis is it takes time. It's not difficult. It's not hard. It's not, terribly complicated. It just takes time and resources.
Time and resource intense. That is what our business is. And, it requires a little know-how, and it requires being, diligent, and it requires digging through the depths of hell and having the patience of a saint. But it's not magic. And, I don't know any other industry that's like that. You go to a lawyer or an accountant, they don't do it. I can do my own taxes, but I give it to my accountant because he's a fucking expert. He reads those 100 page, accounting mandates and can tell me in a couple sentences, this is what he does on a daily basis. This is what I do on a daily basis. And I know how to get stuff. That's what I do. I find shit you can't. And that's one of my little tokens. But it's time and resource intense. And that's just the bottom line.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, I mean, it doesn't hurt me to explain to people, even in a blog post or on a webinar or anywhere else, how it is that we do this work, because I know for a fact a lot of people just don't want to spend the time doing it. So I'm going to be fine. I'm going to have work. I'm going to be okay. I'm fine sharing that information.
And it even happens within our industry. You know, there are so many solo practitioners in this business that work sort of as like lone wolves. And I think I've talked to so many of these people, and they're like, you know, I just don't know if I'm doing this right. This way, I've been doing it for years. That's one of the unique positions I've been in, is I've got to work with a lot of different firms. So I see how a lot of different people do things. So it becomes this, everybody's got their own little, you know, secrets. And I just don't think it does the industry as a whole any good.
Right. All right. Well, we are bumping right up against the 2 o'clock hour here in Nashville, which means the 3 o'clock hour there in New York. Couple things real quick. If you haven't yet, if you joined us late in the show, subscribe to our YouTube channel. It doesn't cost you a thing. It helps us out to have more subscribers. We would love to have you be a subscriber. So I just got one last question. Let me see if I've posted this opinion before. Be careful of confirmation bias, a flaw that occurs when you only search information that is consistent with one's favorite hypothesis, and devaluing, ignoring, or explaining information that is not. This is from Research Investigations Agency, LLC, and that's absolutely right. When we go into these investigations, we have to do it with an open mind. We can't go into it looking for a preconceived notion, and I totally get that, and I second that 100%. So going back to getting out of this thing, Brian, thank you for joining us today. We're thrilled you were here and had the time to do it. I know you're busy. We all are. We've had a little over 100 people in the room today, and that's totally exciting. For the folks still in the webinar, subscribe to the YouTube channel. We'd love to have you. Also, if you need some continuing education, or if you just want to learn more about this topic, Intel 18, INTEL 18, lowercase, no spaces, is a discount code you can use at pieducation.com on the open source intelligence course, 6 hours of continuing education. Log in today, use that discount code. The code is valid until the end of the month, May the 31st. So do that. Brian, again, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate everybody coming in. I don't know how 100 people listening to me and might have bored to tears, but if you have any questions and want to talk, I love shooting the shit about this stuff, or want to talk about techniques or whatever you want, happy. So you can shoot me an email at brian@diligentiagroup.com. I'm sure there'll be a link going around about my website. So feel free to reach out.
Yeah. Thanks again so much. Everybody have a great weekend and a good rest of the month of May.
Take care.
That's it for the PI Education webinar for May 2018.